My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a senior payroll coordinator for a regional hospital in Columbus, Ohio. Numbers have always been easier for me than people. 3 years after my younger sister ran away with the man I'd been married to for 8 years, the only person who still believed our family could be stitched back together was my father. He spent 5 straight days polishing the old oak dining table, repainting the porch railings, and wrapping my grandmother's porcelain teacup in fresh linen because he insisted it should sit at the head of the table again. Then, at exactly 6:47 p.m., my sister walked through the front door, looked me up and down, smiled, and laughed. Still single? LOL. For hours later, that same porcelain teacup sat cracked across the dining table, surrounded by absolute silence. What she didn't know that evening, and what almost nobody else understood, was that those 7 careless words weren't the beginning of our story. They were simply the moment every quiet betrayal finally became impossible to ignore. Growing up, my family never admitted we had favorites. They didn't have to. The proof sat inside a glass cabinet in our dining room. My grandmother's white porcelain teacup, painted with tiny blue forget-me-not flowers around the rim, only came out for the person everyone agreed had made the family proud that year. Birthdays didn't matter. Report cards didn't matter. Promotions didn't matter. Somehow the cup almost always found its way into my younger sister Claire's hands. When she won debate competitions, she drank from it. When she got accepted into college, she drank from it. Even after she dropped out 6 months later, my mother still said Claire had more potential than anyone else. Dad never liked the tradition, but he never argued loudly enough to stop it either. Instead, he quietly made up for the imbalance in smaller ways. He drove me to my first job interview in a pickup truck that barely started. He sat through my accounting certification ceremony wearing the same navy suit he'd owned for 15 years. When my marriage collapsed because Claire decided my husband looked better beside her than beside me, Dad was the only one who showed up at my apartment carrying homemade chicken soup and a toolbox because he noticed the kitchen cabinet door hanging crooked. "I'm fixing something today," he'd said while tightening loose screws. Even if it's only a cabinet. Looking back, I realize I wasn't just the woman everyone overlooked. I helped make it normal. Every Thanksgiving when Claire interrupted me, I smiled instead of finishing my sentence. Every Christmas when my mother praised Claire for achievements she hadn't actually earned, I stayed quiet because arguing seemed exhausting. Every time someone joked that Claire could talk her way into heaven, I laughed along, even when her charm came at someone else's expense. I mistook keeping the peace for protecting the family. 3 years passed after the affair. Claire married my ex-husband, Daniel. I rebuilt my life one ordinary Tuesday at a time. I rented a smaller apartment, adopted a sleepy golden retriever named Murphy, earned a promotion, and stopped expecting apologies that were never coming. Then Dad called me on a Tuesday evening in early September. "I want one family gathering," he said. "Not for appearances. For me." He was 68 by then, and recovering from heart surgery he'd had 11 months earlier. His voice carried a softness I hadn't heard before. "I've already spoken to everyone," he added. I didn't simply trust him. I verified everything. At 8:12 p.m., he sent a message in our family group chat confirming dinner for Saturday at 6 o'clock. Claire replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Daniel wrote, "We'll be there." The next morning, Dad forwarded me a screenshot after calling Claire personally. "She promised," he texted. On Thursday afternoon, my Aunt Linda stopped by his house while I was helping arrange folding chairs in the backyard. She heard Dad ask Claire over speakerphone whether everyone understood this gathering was supposed to be respectful. Claire laughed lightly. "Relax," she said. "Don't be so dramatic. Winners win." Nobody challenged the words. Dad simply sighed and continued setting another place at the table. Including mine. Including hers. And, without realizing it, he placed my grandmother's porcelain teacup exactly where everything that had been quietly broken for years was finally about to break in public. Saturday arrived warm and unusually quiet. By 4:18 p.m., Dad had already lit the citronella candles on the back patio, even though the sun wouldn't set for another 3 hours. The roast was resting beneath aluminum foil. Fresh rolls sat under a linen towel. My grandmother's porcelain teacup waited at the center of the dining table, exactly where Dad had placed it 2 days earlier. At 5:41 p.m., my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a message in the family group chat. Claire had uploaded a selfie from inside her SUV with Daniel beside her. Both of them were smiling. Her caption read, "Running a little late. Natalie, don't tell me you're still taking all this personally. Winners win. Asterisk." A second message appeared 12 seconds later. Still single? LOL. Asterisk. The typing bubbles disappeared. No apology. No, just kidding. Nothing. I looked up from the dining room table where I was folding cloth napkins. Dad was in the kitchen carefully slicing the peach pie he'd baked from scratch that morning. The smell of cinnamon filled the house while my phone still glowed in my hand. It struck me how strange grief could be. Everything around me looked like preparation for a celebration, yet the room suddenly felt like it belonged to a funeral. When Claire and Daniel finally arrived at 6:47 p.m., she repeated the same words in person, almost proudly. "Still single? LOL." Then she laughed, as if she'd simply quoted a funny movie line. Nobody laughed with her. Dad stopped holding the pie server halfway through the first slice. For a moment, I honestly believed he might finally tell her to leave. Instead, he quietly placed the pie back on the counter and said, almost to himself, "Dinner's getting cold." That hurt more than shouting would have. During the meal, Dad barely spoke. He asked whether anyone wanted more potatoes. He refilled water glasses that weren't empty. He complimented the green beans 3 separate times because nobody else knew what to say. His silence wasn't surrender. It was exhaustion. Watching him avoid another family explosion pulled old memories into focus with uncomfortable clarity. Claire borrowing my favorite dress in high school and returning it stained. Claire announcing her engagement during my birthday dinner because she didn't want to waste everyone being together. Claire convincing relatives that Daniel and she had accidentally fallen in love, as though 8 years of my marriage had simply been bad timing. Every memory carried the same pattern. She crossed a line. Someone minimized it. I accepted it. The truth settled over me with surprising calm. Claire hadn't become this person overnight. Our family had rewarded her for years. And I had helped. Every time I smiled instead of objecting. Every time I accepted an apology that never really existed. Every time I chose comfort over honesty. I wasn't only the woman who'd been betrayed. I had participated in the system that taught Claire consequences were optional. After dinner, I stepped onto the back porch, pretending to check on Murphy, who was asleep beneath the maple tree. Instead, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "Can you please talk to Claire?" I asked. "Just once. Tell her those comments weren't okay." There was a long pause. "Oh, Natalie," Mom sighed. "She's always had a sharp sense of humor. Don't make it a thing. Tonight is about your father." I wasn't the one who made it a thing. "But you'll become the problem if you keep talking about it." She hung up before I could answer. I stared at the dark screen for several seconds before calling my Aunt Linda, hoping she'd at least acknowledge what had happened. Instead, she said, "Honey, Clara's always been competitive. That's just who she is. If you react, she'll only enjoy it more. Sometimes being the bigger person means saying nothing." Being the bigger person. I'd been hearing that sentence for nearly 20 years. What it had really meant was making myself smaller. I slipped my phone into my pocket and leaned against the porch railing. Behind me, I could hear dishes clinking softly through the open kitchen window. A gentle voice interrupted my thoughts. "You don't have to keep protecting everyone else." It was Dad's next-door neighbor, Mr. Harold Jensen, 74 years old, who had quietly come over to return the extension ladder he'd borrowed that morning. He'd heard enough through the open window to understand more than anyone wanted to admit. He handed me the ladder, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "There's a difference between keeping peace and feeding disrespect. You've done the first for years. Stop doing the second." For the first time since Claire had stolen my husband 3 years earlier, someone wasn't asking me to endure a little more. Someone was giving me permission to stop. That night, After everyone had gone home and the dishwasher hummed in the kitchen, I sat alone at Dad's dining table staring at the empty chair Claire had occupied. For 3 years, I'd been trying to earn a fair place inside a family system that had never measured fairness to begin with. Around 10:56 p.m., I finally understood something that felt almost embarrassingly simple. I wasn't trapped. I was volunteering to stay. The next morning I told Dad, "I'm done fighting for a better seat at someone else's table." He looked at me for a long moment before quietly nodding. "So build your own." Those 4 words settled something inside me. The following weekend, I reserved the community room at Riverside Park for a small autumn dinner. Nothing extravagant. 12 folding chairs, homemade food, paper lanterns, children running across the grass. People who actually wanted to be there. I even left one chair empty. Not because Claire deserved it. Because I refused to become the kind of person who excluded others just to feel powerful. The empty chair was for possibility, not punishment. Monday evening, I opened my phone to tell the family. My first draft read, "Asterisk, if anyone wants another dinner where Claire gets to mock me while everyone watches, don't bother coming." Asterisk. I deleted it. The second draft was even worse. Asterisk, congratulations on protecting your favorite daughter for 30 years. You finally have the family you chose. Asterisk. Delete. I closed my eyes, made another cup of coffee, and started over. The message I finally sent at 7:18 p.m. was only 58 words. Asterisk, I'm hosting a family dinner at Riverside Park this Saturday at 5:30 p.m. Everyone is welcome. There won't be speeches or arguments. I'd simply like to spend time with anyone who wants a peaceful evening together. If you choose to come, please come with kindness. Asterisk. No accusations. No references to Claire. No emotional traps. Within minutes, my Aunt Linda replied with a heart emoji. Dad wrote, asterisk, I'll bring dessert. Asterisk. My cousin Ethan asked if his twins could come. Then, at 7:31 p.m., Claire answered. Asterisk, LOL. Your loss. Asterisk. Nothing else. No one defended her this time. No one asked me to apologize for existing. Saturday afternoon arrived with an unexpected breeze that kept trying to blow napkins across the picnic tables. It wasn't perfect. Dad accidentally forgot the serving spoon for the mashed potatoes. Ethan's twins spilled lemonade before anyone had eaten. Murphy stole half a hamburger from a distracted teenager, creating the loudest laughter I'd heard in months. It was wonderfully ordinary. Later that evening, Dad carried my grandmother's porcelain teacup out of the insulated box he'd wrapped it in. The tiny crack from years earlier was still visible, though carefully repaired. Everyone assumed he'd drink from it. Instead, he placed it in front of Mrs. Eleanor Jensen, Harold's wife, who had spent the entire afternoon helping serve food, washing dishes in the park restroom, and making every shy guest feel welcome. You've earned this today, Dad said simply. Nobody questioned the choice. For the first time in my memory, the teacup wasn't given to the loudest person. It belonged to the kindest. A day later, my cousin Megan called after attending another gathering at my mother's house where Claire and Daniel had hosted an elegant catered brunch. The food was expensive, she admitted. Everything looked beautiful. She hesitated. But nobody stayed very long. People kept checking their phones. Conversation never really started. It felt like everyone was performing. I wasn't happy to hear it. There was no victory in imagining another table feeling empty. Because building something healthier didn't erase what it had cost. My marriage was still gone. 3 birthdays had passed without a real conversation with my mother. There were relatives who would probably never choose my table over Claire's. Dad noticed the look on my face while we packed leftover food into containers. You know, he said quietly, people don't become who they are all by themselves. He wasn't defending Claire. He was grieving her. Years of being told she was special had taught her that admiration was something to consume instead of something to earn. I nodded. Understanding someone isn't the same thing as excusing them. Sometimes it's simply the first step toward finally setting them down. Nearly 6 months passed before I saw Claire again. It was a rainy Saturday in March. At exactly 9:14 a.m., Murphy barked twice, then went strangely quiet. When I opened my apartment door, Claire was standing in the hallway holding nothing but a folded umbrella and wearing a beige coat that looked far more expensive than it needed to be. "I know I should have called," she said. I looked at the clock above my coat rack. "I'll be with you in 10 minutes. Then I closed the door. It wasn't meant to humiliate her. For years, she had controlled every conversation by arriving loudly, speaking first, and forcing everyone else to react. For the first time, the pace belonged to me. When I opened the door again at 9:24 a.m., she was still there. We walked to the small coffee shop 2 blocks away. She tried the old version of herself almost immediately. "You always were too sensitive." I stirred my coffee without answering. A minute later, she tried another familiar tactic. "So everyone thinks I'm the villain now?" Again, I let the silence do the work. Without an audience, without relatives rushing to rescue her, those lines simply fell flat. For the first time in my life, Claire looked unsure of what came next. After several quiet moments, she asked something I never expected to hear. "Do you think Dad still loves me?" It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't rehearsed. It sounded like a frightened little sister I hadn't seen in decades. I answered honestly, "Yes." She let out a shaky breath. "But love isn't the same as trust." She nodded without arguing. Then she asked if I could help her fix things. For years I imagined that moment. I used to think I'd demand an apology for stealing Daniel. I'd make her list every lie she'd told. I'd ask why she thought humiliating me was entertaining. Instead, none of those questions mattered anymore. I told her there was only one condition. "If you really want to come back into this family, don't start with me." She frowned. "Start with Dad. Not a text. Not flowers. Not a gift. Sit with him. Listen more than you speak. Apologize for the years, not just one dinner." She quietly agreed. A week later, she went to his house. I wasn't there. Dad later told me they talked for almost 3 hours in the backyard, long after the coffee had gone cold. He never repeated exactly what either of them said. Neither did Claire. Some conversations deserve privacy after spending years surrounded by spectators. All Dad shared was this: "She finally stopped trying to win." That was enough for me. By the end of summer, our family looked different. Not perfect. Different. The old tradition of deciding who deserved my grandmother's porcelain teacup disappeared completely. Instead, every family gathering began with something new. Each person wrote one sentence on a small card describing something another family member had done that month which deserved gratitude. The cards were read aloud before dinner, then placed inside a wooden box Dad built in his garage. Nobody competed. Nobody ranked higher than anyone else. The repaired porcelain teacup stayed in the middle of the table, filled with fresh forget-me-nots instead of tea. One evening, I noticed Claire quietly washing the teacup after dinner. She dried it carefully with both hands before placing it back in its box. She didn't announce she had changed. She simply handled what had once symbolized status, as though it had become something that belonged to everyone. That mattered more than another apology. A year later, Dad celebrated his 70th birthday. The dining table was full. Not because every wound had disappeared, but because nobody had to earn a place anymore. Claire sat beside my cousin instead of at the head of the table. Nobody commented. It felt natural. As for me, I eventually stopped introducing myself as the woman whose sister stole her husband. That sentence had once felt like my entire identity. Now it was only something that had happened. Daniel was no longer part of my story except as a chapter that had already ended. Murphy still waited beneath the table for dropped food. Dad still overcooked the rolls by exactly 3 minutes every holiday. And every gathering ended with someone carefully wrapping the repaired porcelain teacup in soft linen before putting it away for next time. Looking back, I sometimes think about 6:47 p.m., 3 years, and the one empty chair I left waiting for someone who hadn't earned it yet. I don't regret leaving it there. Because the strongest families aren't the ones that never break. They're the ones that stop confusing forgiveness with permission, repair what's worth saving, and learn that the people who laugh at your loneliness rarely realize that peace is something you quietly build without their approval.